Welcome to This Explainer. We all absolutely love a good underdog story, right? But today, we are diving into what has to be one of the most fascinating political shifts in history. We're going to look at how a localized regional faction somehow managed to establish the absolute largest Indian empire of its time. And they didn't just slowly rise to power, they actively and aggressively challenged both the massive established Mughal Empire and the heavily armed European forces that were arriving by sea. It's just an incredible story of strategy and resilience.
So this brings us to a really compelling historical question. How exactly did a homegrown force pull this off simultaneously? To understand this, we kind of have to look past advanced weaponry. The Europeans, they definitely had much better ship technology. And the Mughals, they had these sprawling, established armies. The real secret to the Marathas' success actually lay in their highly adaptive battle strategies and their really deep understanding of their local geography.
Let's dive right into Section 1, Mastering Mountains and Seas.
The Marathas basically looked at their rugged environment and turned it into both an impenetrable fortress and a brilliant operational launch pad. Take their naval strategy, for instance. You had the standard European approach, which relied heavily on advanced ships to aggressively force locals to buy their naval trade passes. But then you have the Marathas. Under the command of Kanhoji Angre, they completely flipped the script. Despite lacking that European tech, they weaponized the tricky Konkan coastline. They actually started demanding trade passes from the Europeans. The Europeans were so frustrated they could do literally nothing but label Kanhoji a pirate. Now, check out this number, 100 plus. That represents pure reputation and scale. Back in 1665, just 4 Maratha ships sailed all the way to Muscat, the capital of Oman. The local ruler there captured them and confidently started planning a massive counterattack on Shivaji's coastal territories. But the second he heard that Shivaji's active fleet actually contained over 100 ships, he completely abandoned the attack and rushed his own fleet back inside his harbor. That right there is the power of reputation.
So shifting from the sea to the land, they utilized the incredibly rugged Sahyadri Mountains for natural protection. They built these sprawling, nearly unreachable forts right into the peaks, places like Raigad and Pratapgarh. And these weren't just standard castles. They were highly active military bases and administrative hubs. Because of this tricky terrain, they were perfectly positioned to launch highly effective guerrilla warfare. They'd strike like lightning and then just vanish back into the mountains. It made it practically impossible for larger, heavier, and slower armies like the Mughals to ever truly conquer them. Moving on to Section 2, Governance and Fair Justice. Now, conquering and holding territory is really only half the battle. They didn't just rule by brute force. They established an incredibly efficient, decentralized judicial system. At the base level, you had the local panchayat. This is where prominent local officials and citizens would literally gather to hear disputes and deliver justice. But here's the kicker. If a citizen felt a verdict was unfair, they weren't just stuck with it. They had the ultimate right to appeal directly to the Maratha chief. It was a really well-structured system of checks and balances. And this system was remarkably progressive for its era. Capital punishment, for example, was used very, very sparingly, which shows a deep moderation in how they governed. Instead of using heavy military force to maintain everyday law and order, they actually deployed kotwals. These were essentially a dedicated police force assigned to keep the peace in prominent towns like Pune and Indore. All right, let's look at Section 3, Wealth, Trade, and Infrastructure.
Running an underdog empire of this size obviously requires serious funding. Shivaji didn't just sit back and tax his citizens, he actively jumped into foreign maritime trade. They built up this expansive economic network, sending their very own merchant ships loaded with highly valuable cargo, stuff like gold and famous Indian textiles, as far out as Mocha in Yemen, Muscat in Oman, and all the way over to Malacca in Malaysia. And domestically, they poured all that wealth straight back into the land. They constructed new roads across regions like Odisha and built bridges and massive river ferry networks to connect their expanding inland territories. Which brings us to Section 4, the syncretic cultural revival. You see, the Marathas didn't just redraw the map. They had a profound impact on culture and the entire concept of what it meant to actually govern. Listen to the translation of Shivaji's official seal, "Reign for the welfare of the people." This was a huge departure from the Persian seals that were prevalent at the time. Shivaji adopted a Sanskrit seal that beautifully compared his growing authority to a waxing new moon.
But most importantly, it explicitly stated, right there in writing, that the core purpose of his rule was the public's welfare. This entire mindset was driven by the concept of Swaraja. This was the fiery, revolutionary ideal of self-rule and absolute independence from oppressive foreign powers. And what's really key here is that this vision of self-rule strongly promoted religious tolerance. During their military campaigns, Maratha forces were under strict instructions to protect mosques, churches, and civilians of all faiths. They actually took this cultural revival so seriously that they commissioned an entire text called the Rajyavyavahar Kosh. The sole purpose of this document was to replace prevalent Persian diplomatic words with Sanskrit equivalents. It sparked this widespread revival of the Marathi language and really brought ancient Indian values back to the front of everyday statecraft. This era also saw some incredibly powerful women step up into monumental roles, which really highlights their inclusive leadership style. Take Ahilyabai Holkar, for example. In a heavily male-dominated society, after the death of her husband, she stepped up and took full charge of the Malwar region, and she ruled with just extraordinary fairness and courage. She encouraged trade, fiercely protected her people during wartime, and built sweeping infrastructure like temples, ghats, and rest houses all across the Indian subcontinent.
And this cultural flourishing wasn't just limited to the north and west. Down south, in Tanjavur, in present-day Tamil Nadu, the Marathas established a brilliantly rich syncretic culture. They fostered an environment where Tamil, Telugu, and Marathi influences freely mixed and interacted with each other, creating a truly vibrant multilingual society. In Thanjavur, leaders like Sorfoji II were seriously pushing boundaries. He founded the Dhanvantari Mahal, which offered free treatments using both Indian and Western medicine, which, if you think about it, is a pretty fantastic healthcare plan for the early 1800s. He also started the very first printing press in India, operated by a native ruler. He was a massive patron of the arts, and even commissioned the largest single inscription of his family's history right on the walls of the Brihadiswara temple. The man was a true visionary.
And finally, Section 5. Seeds of Indian Independence.
When we look at their ultimate long-lasting legacy, the overall shift is just staggering. In the pre-Maratha era, you had almost total Mughal dominance and deep vulnerability to aggressive European naval demands. But by the Maratha era, this homegrown faction had successfully challenged that dominance. They stretched their control from the Deccan Plateau all the way up to Delhi, creating the largest Indian empire of its time, totally defined by decentralized governance and cultural unity.
So the crucial takeaway here, something that often gets overlooked in history class, is this. The British East India Company did not just casually walk into India and easily take over a declining Mughal empire. Not even close. Before the British could become the main power in the subcontinent, they had to fight 3 grueling, intense Anglo-Maratha wars. The Marathas were, without a doubt, the ultimate barrier to colonial rule. Which leaves us with this powerful question to ponder as we wrap up. How did the 17th century Maratha ideal of Swarajaya ultimately lay the conceptual groundwork for India's 20th century independence movement? By proving that a homegrown, regional power could successfully govern itself, build an inclusive economy, and fiercely resist foreign oppression, the Marathas planted the very early seeds of the modern Indian freedom struggle. It is a legacy of self-belief that echoes right into the modern era. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer.